Welcome to the Beyond Body podcast with your hosts, Mia and Holly. Join us for a sometimes fortnightly podcast
where we explore all things mental health, being a messy human, and how to get the most out of this one precious life.
And all the ridiculous stories in between.
Hello, listeners, and welcome back to the Beyond Body podcast. As always, I am joined by the brilliant Amelia Finlay. Welcome back, Mel.
Oh, I'm getting just a range of the names lately. I love it. I forget the Amelia piece sometimes. It's my mum and Josie. Josie refuses to call me Mia or anything other than Amelia.
Really?
Oh, yeah. Like even my niece Nina, like whenever I drop a Mia, Josie's like, no. She must be conditioned to like go with my propaganda.
I like being called different things by different people because it just feels like quite personal.
Yeah. Well, I like your mill for me because I was thinking of it the other day because I call you Hole. So it's a hole and mill. It's like it just nice and tidy. Love it. So where are you? What are you doing? What's been a highlight of recent travel stories?
Oh gosh, the poor listeners must be getting a little bit tired of hearing about my travel stories. Don't fret, everyone. It's almost over. But at the moment, I am jet lagged. So you're in for a good episode. And I'm in Costa Rica, which is great. I feel like I'm just eating lots of tacos and I'm watching lots of like really intense tropical storms roll in. You know, the kind of storms where the lightning lights up an entire room?
Yeah.
It's those kind of storms. So it's happening every night. So at like 2, 3 a.m. I'm like woken up with like the most amazing bright lightning, which is actually like super beautiful and super cool.
Wow, gorgeous. I've never had Costa Rica on my list, but I don't know what it is. Recently, I've seen it coming up in a lot of like shows I watch or documentaries I watch or stuff I see on Instagram around travel. I'm like, this just looks, it's like you said to me the other day when we were talking that Bali, it's very Bali-esque. It just
I feel like
stunning.
I literally feel like I'm in Bali.
Yeah.
I just think maybe people from Europe and the States come here because it's closer than Bali. And I'm like, oh, I've been here before, guys. This isn't new to me. But yeah, it's super, super beautiful.
Stoked. So gorgeous. Love it. I'm going to need all your lists of where you've been, where you've stayed, all your Airbnbs, all your accommodation.
I will definitely do that for you. For everyone.
Little Google Doc would come in very, very handy, especially because you and I are still talking about our travel to Europe and the UK next April for us to do something exciting in London, which is in the works. I know that we've had a number of people emailing and leaving comments who are very excited about that prospect. It is becoming a more solid plan. We are very much in the works. And excitingly, because we can go via a couple of spots on the way to the UK, including Dubai, and we have a fabulous team member, Sophia, who's in Dubai, we're also potentially planning to do something there as well. Thoughts and feelings about that at the moment?
Super exciting. I think, I obviously have such a travel bug after being away for almost 5 months. But yeah, I feel like that's amazing to be able to like get community involved that we don't always necessarily get to work with is super, super cool. How much information are we disclosing? But we love the idea of a live event.
Yes. And maybe some workshops and maybe some little Q&A panel-y things and in a beautiful space and I haven't been to London. I said this to you the other day. I lived in London when I was in my early 20s. And I haven't been back. Like I hadn't even gone into recovery the last time I was there. So I was living in London. I was traveling through Europe very much with my eating disorder. So I'm very excited. Like there's a couple of, I want to go back to Paris and I want to go back to Rome. A couple of the spots I went to with my eating disorder in tow. It's nice to not have that passenger coming with me this time.
Let me tell you, traveling around Europe with an eating disorder versus without, the latter is so much better.
Yeah.
So much.
That could be a really good episode, actually. Let's put that on the list, like travel with an eating disorder in recovery post, because obviously you and I see that with clients as well as, how much travel can impact the recovery process from both the good and the bad. We'll definitely pop that one on the list. But before we get to our thing today, we also wanted to mention in the topic of sort of cool things we're doing. You are doing something very cool upcoming in your business, not in the Beyond Body business, but in your beautiful business. Do you want to tell the people a little bit about this amazing program you're running?
I can tell the people a little bit about that. So I'm running a 6 week program. It's called the Dinner Club. So it's a meal support and it's also a 6 week program. It's each week is based on a different self-development topic.
Mhm.
And yes, it's meal support, but the aim of it is that the meal that we're sharing together is very much the background music to the conversation that we're having. So it's very much about learning. We do a meditation together, we eat together, but it's also just about like building community. So it's Australian Eastern Standard Time. It's of an evening, running for 6 weeks. So if you're interested in that, drop into the DMs or shoot me an email and I can send you some more info about it.
And all that information will be in the show notes. And as somebody who has been privileged enough to cook with Holly and be her very unskilled sous chef at times and had the privilege of enjoying the fruits of her labor, it is a real experience to be able to cook with Holly or to be in her presence while she's sort of presenting these things. So please jump on that opportunity. And like I said, all that stuff will be in the notes below. But for today, what are we talking about with the people for this episode?
The people
The
is
people.
going to be the most overused phrase of this podcast episode.
I've got,
We're
I
talking
get stuck in like terminology and then it's just like she does it till it's dead on the road.
about the people.
Yeah, the
So we are
people.
talking about what we wish the people understood about eating disorders. And you sent out to, I can't say it again, can't say it again, to the community
Yes.
what you thought. Well, ask the sort of the question, what is it that you wish the world knew about eating disorders that are often things that are a bit misunderstood, or there's, I mean, there's so many eating disorder myths out there as well.
The complexities, the layers, the color that gets missed, especially maybe in media representations or amongst your family and friends. This happens to me all the time. I always say this happens to me at the hairdresser. My job, chatting to either the hairdresser or
Yeah.
someone who's sitting next to me will come up and the misconceptions do come up. That's when I'll sort of get into it with people and just gently correct them and more from that sort of like awareness piece of the stuff they
Oh,
believe. I'll try
yeah.
to nudge that. But
Yeah.
yeah, I always say to people, if you ever want to break the ice and you're in the eating disorder space, just say what you do for a living because everyone's got a story, everyone knows
Yeah.
someone or have had this experience,
Yes.
which is why it's so important for people to have the correct information.
Oh, absolutely. And there's so many different things out there. And I think just for people in the eating disorder world, they can so easily, so often feel misunderstood. And I think a lot
Mm.
of these reasons that we're going to get into is why.
Absolutely. So the first one that was sent across to us was that you can have an eating disorder at any weight.
There's so many different things about this one, particularly that we could talk about. I
Yeah.
think this one is so important for people inside of the eating disorder recovery world to understand, but also so important for people outside of the eating disorder world to understand. So if
Mhm.
you're in it, right, whether you're someone who is struggling with an eating disorder, or you are like a loved one of someone who is struggling, or you're even a professional who will
Yeah.
cross paths with someone in the eating disorder space, it's so important to realize that anyone at any weight can have an eating disorder. And
Mhm.
this one is so dangerous, I think, because it's so invalidating for people who deserve and just need care.
Yes.
Um, and I mean, I went to a doctor earlier in the year, maybe it was last year about something, and it was like the same thing you do with your hairdresser. Like they were just like asking me what I do for a living, and I sort of said, I like this is my job. And she, who was like, a GP, young GP, would have been 30. She said to me, she's like, "Oh, it's a really hard industry, isn't it? Like they just never really get better." I was like, mm.
Oh,
In my mind, I know. In my mind, I thought, well, not if you have someone, not if that you're the GP.
yeah, yeah.
What I actually said was, I don't think you're really educated on this subject, are you?
Good
And then we
on
got
you.
into this like confusing, heated conversation while she was like giving me my like, blood test.
Yeah.
But even like that's an example, right? Like that's a professional who could absolutely like you could be the first entry point for someone, and they need to also realize that eating disorders are not this just physical expression, and that is a
Yes.
huge oversight.
Yes, absolutely. Like on one hand, we say eating disorders are not weight disorders, which is absolutely
Yeah.
correct. But
Yes.
that doesn't take it the step further, which is that they are way more diverse in body and across every single part of the spectrum. You can, and with intersectionality taken into account as possible.
Yes.
But that's definitely the area when I read this misconception that sends off alarm bells in my head is that first point of entry concern that I have, which when Butterfly received its first really decent chunk of funding in 2019, despite the fact that there are so many competing priorities when it comes to funding and, where to
Mm.
sort of put that money, the first thing they put it towards was a program re-educating GPs. And it was no
Mm.
mystery to me because everyone was like, why is that the thing? Absolutely no mystery to me why that's the case, because we just hear too many stories of people who are being handled so incorrectly when they go to see their GP. And
Yeah.
so much of it comes down to this weight thing,
Yeah.
right? And I truly believe that this misconception is largely responsible for the fact that people get to a point of maybe being in a chronic state of illness that they never would have, or they get into
Mm.
kind of like that revolving door system that they otherwise never would have. Because when you have a professional sitting there, and I've heard this too many times, when you have a
Okay.
professional sitting there saying to somebody, you're not small enough or thin enough, or you don't look unwell enough, or you couldn't possibly have an eating disorder because you're in X body or your body size is X weight or whatever it might be, the eating disorder, that is its greatest fuel source
Yeah.
because
Confirmation bias. Yeah.
yeah, for the healthy self, it's devastating. For the eating disorder self, it's like, thanks for the challenge. And for
Mm.
people with behavioral profiles where that isn't even the case, just that level of invalidation is so damaging and so incredibly dangerous, because that could be the last attempt somebody ever makes to reach out for help. Um,
Oh.
which is understandable. Like when people say to me, Mia, I can't, like, I just cannot I can't step foot in another medical professional's office. And I'm like, you must. I will help you navigate that conversation. Like I will help you find someone who's going to be a better professional, especially in this arena. But
Mm.
you must. But on the other hand, I also say to them, but I totally understand
Yeah.
why you don't want to. We must
Mm.
continue to advocate for ourselves. But gosh, what kind of message are we sending people when they pluck up the courage to do that and they're met with this kind of reaction where they're just being taken based on their body size,
Mm.
and basically told that their suffering doesn't even exist.
It's so incredibly invalidating, and I'm there's so many different areas in which this has to be targeted. It's obviously like the immediate, it's that first point of call, but it's also obviously looking at where did this come from, which is such a slower change that we're going to have to, hopefully see over time where there actually is, more body diversity that is shown across, popular culture with anything that is in relation to anything eating disorder. Because still, it is very much the stereotype of this thin, white, privileged woman is the person who has an eating disorder. And I,
Yes.
I think it's a part of just being an adult, of having to also look at the narratives that we've been fed and decide if they're bullshit or not, and if you want
Mm,
to continue to have them moving forward. So let's say someone is like they know they're struggling with food and they really want to get support and they're really trying to challenge these things that they believe about, like they've been conditioned to believe about what is a good body and bad body and what is right and wrong, and then they go into a GP who then like confirms and be like, oh, but you're not sick enough.
yeah.
There's so many different layers to it, and it's so deeply complex. So I think even knowing that if you're that person who is like struggling with this and you've gone to the GP and you've been invalidated, a big part of that as well is that unfortunately the things that we have been made to believe through popular culture or magazines when we're younger or whatever it is, we're living with that stigma. And
Yes.
often we're also then like we're actually continuing to pass on the stigma by default accidentally to ourselves. The
Mm,
other area I really see this in as well is, say it's someone who's in recovery and they just because of their behavioral profile, part of it has had to be to weight restore, and
mm,
they get to make this point where they're in like green zone healthy weight. This belief as well then is at play then, and it really often works as a roadblock for people because they're like, but now I'm not worthy of treatment,
yeah.
or I'm not sick anymore, or I'm recovered, and like not recovered
No.
yet, absolutely, which we'll get into later, and B, you're absolutely worthy of support. So you can see even then there's sort of this almost like a bit of like still subconscious stigma, even though all the work that someone has done of believing who is worthy of support, because of this like very much myth that there's only certain bodies that have eating disorders.
Yes, and it's so enormous. Like obviously it really lets down so many people, especially across the body size spectrum, people who are in those larger body sizes, because especially since like the advent of Ozempic, which I have got such a
Mm.
encyclopedia of opinions about. We could be
Oh,
here for
we'll do an
10
episode on it.
hours. I'd be more than happy. I think it's, it's very new, so we're still learning a lot about it, but I'm
Yeah.
starting to see some of the impacts, one of which being
Yes.
when I have clients or I speak to people who are in larger bodies who do go to medical professionals, Ozempic is suggested to them. Not only are there concerns about their eating disorder or potential eating disorder or disordered eating invalidated, they're then handed a weight loss drug. Or they have weight loss surgery recommended to them. I've heard this over and over and over again over the years, which is again kind of the other end of the spectrum from how, some people in smaller bodies, their eating disorder is medicalized with just like, let's just get you to a BMI target. And then we're medicalizing it in this other way, and that's
Yes.
in a way that's completely irrelevant and just not medical professionals not willing to do the deeper work around weight stigma and all of
Mm.
these just overly simplistic views that we have about body weight equating to some kind of health status or indicator. Um,
Mm.
so yeah, I think it lets people down all across the spectrum in really, really damaging ways.
Yeah, absolutely.
So the next one, which I actually find really interesting, is they are not all about being into appearances or vanity. The reason
Yeah.
I found this one so interesting is because I really like how this person worded this, where they
Mm.
added some gray to it by saying they are not all about being into appearances or vanity, because we should never really be talking in absolutes in this space of eating
Yes.
disorders because everyone is not going to have a uniform experience. But I will see posts sometimes of people saying eating disorders are not about appearance or vanity. And for some
Mm.
people, that's just not true. Like for me, that's just
Yeah.
not true. I was very focused on my appearance. I was very hyper fixated on what my body looked like and making that as quote unquote perfect and obedient and right and what I thought it should look like and meeting these standards. I was very focused on that and fixated on
Mm.
that. The issue is that we're misinterpreting, I think, even from like an awareness and recovery standpoint, what that means. People hear that and they think it's insulting, which I understand because that backs up the stigma as far as it's just about people being vain and just caring about
Yeah.
what they look like. And so who cares about them if that's their value system? Why would we help people who are that shallow? It's a symptom. It's part of the symptomatic
Yeah.
profile. It's just like not sick enough is a symptom. It's deeper and more complicated than that.
Mm.
Whereby,
Mm.
yes, I was
Mm.
very, you could say, from the outward appearance, I looked incredibly vain. If you were sitting and talking to me and there was a mirror behind you, I wasn't looking at you once. I was staring at myself
Oh,
the whole time because I was so, that sound familiar?
I was going to say the same example.
That's so funny. Um, because I was so paranoid about not looking the way that I
Mm.
thought that I should look, because that was something that had been ingrained in me from a very young age that this is how I was acceptable, this is how I was safe, this is how I wasn't going to be criticized and judged and ridiculed and
Yes.
rejected,
Yes.
was to
Yes.
absolutely hold on to this standard of beauty that was going to keep me tethered to people and make me feel safe, particularly internally, like it was my little life raft. And it
Oh
was
my
a
God, I
big
love that you
distraction for other people. Like, don't look
bring.
at the real me, look at this thing I've made.
That's a very, very, very important point there, I think, because I love that you've pulled out the gray there, because I
Mm.
also thought the same thing. Because it's if it was that eating disorders are not about being into appearances of vanity, it's like, well, like there's so much more nuance to it than that. And I think when I was in my own sickness, I was also very confused by this,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
actually did question. I was like, am I just vain? Like I actually thought this before I was able to really unwind the patterns and like did the necessary healing work. I didn't really know why I was doing what I was doing. I just thought
Mm.
it was maybe like how I lived in the world and had more of a preoccupation on these things. I didn't really want to, but I kind of like felt like I had to.
Yeah.
And what is really quite sad, like I very much had the same example that you said there. For most of my life, I would more like body check, but also face check, and it would be in
Mm.
reflective surfaces. And it actually became a bit of a joke with my family that they would always think they were doing that because I was vain,
Yeah.
when actually it was giving me a sense of okayness. And it was this like nasty habitual habit it that I felt like I just needed to be okay in a moment. But every time I did it, and then like someone would be like, "Oh, look, oh, what's happening over there, Holly?" Or like whatever someone would say to me,
Hmm.
it would like just really jar me because I didn't understand why I was doing it, but I knew that I was doing it because I didn't feel okay in a certain moment. So,
Yeah.
I like had a fixation on appearances, but it wasn't coming from this place of vanity. It was very much coming from this place of survival. I do also understand how people who have eating disorders, who this maybe isn't like super relatable to them, they can find it really offensive.
Yeah.
Because we obviously know, and I feel like everyone who would be listening to this podcast would know that eating disorders arise from a bucket of potential underlying psychological issues that
Hmm.
are, employed, like you were saying, in this misguided effort to help you feel right, like okay,
Yeah.
and just to help the individual cope with whatever the emotional distress and challenges are. And changing one's appearance is a way to do that, right? It's
Yeah.
not what it's about, but it is a way to do that. Like you were saying, it's a symptom, it's the attempt to soothe. So it's just not, I don't see it as a vanity issue. I see it as again, it's a really simplified way to look at it because
Yeah.
that's literally just the surface expression. I think, and I again can't speak for everyone, but for the collective, but I can very confidently assume that too many people who suffer with these illnesses are not doing these things because they want attention or a vein, or they often want to disappear. Like you're saying, they want to be invisible because they can't stand themselves, or they have this deep fear of feeling, not enoughness. So they feel like they have
Yes.
to change themselves because of that. I think the eating disorder uses the physical to express the emotional that has no other way of being heard, right?
Yeah.
I think the physical body just becomes the focus and the obsession. But it isn't to do with appearances. Like we were saying, like eating disorder is about survival, not vanity.
Yeah. And it's such an interesting experience to reflect
Mm,
on because I feel so distant from so many of these things. But when we have these conversations,
yeah.
like memories will pop up because I remember being on when I was living in London and I found a flat to live in my last dime and I didn't have a job yet. And I told them I did anyway. And I was on the train with like my two suitcases and my backpack. And these guys were talking to each other about me and they thought I couldn't hear them. And they were talking about my appearance. And it wasn't really objectifying gross, but it was still
Mm,
inappropriate, right? But it was like they thought they were being complimentary. And I remember getting so angry and being like, if you knew what I go through to do you know what I mean? Like it's so I craved that affirmation so much and then I would get it and I would be so angry in response to it.
yeah.
And I think that was such a clear indicator of my two value systems like butting up against each other, which is why
Mm,
I love that that's the first thing we do with people at our retreats, where, we don't just do write down your values and like that's nice. That's it. Just look at them. We really establish that your eating disorder self has its own values. And this is part of it, which is this, more surface kind of
yeah.
objectification of the body. And then your healthy self has a very different set of values, even as it relates to your embodiment and your experience of it and your appreciation of it. And so those, this thing that your eating disorder chases is such like a betrayal of your healthy self. And I think that when we finally get the thing we thought we wanted, it just absolutely falls short because it doesn't contain all the things we really want. We never really do feel a sense of acceptance or
Mm,
belonging, or because no one's really seeing the real us. They're seeing this physical
yeah.
thing that we've carved out, and we go like, that's me, look at that. And then all the real parts of you are hidden away and never get affirmed and never get seen. It's so like, I think about that 20 something year old in London and I just feel so sad for her.
Hmm. At least it's cool, Mil, that we all get to go back there, and it'll probably be like quite sentimental for you, being like you're creating new memories in this place.
Yeah, yeah, it'll be very, very surreal. And it was a fairly happy. It was like that classic quote: "Best of times, worst of times." So next one we had from the people, mental recovery is so much slower than physical recovery. What do you think of that one?
I love this person has written in here is so much
Yeah,
slower. Like capitals. Like
yeah,
they are in the trenches. I
yeah,
promise you it gets. Because this often is the reality. Because, for everyone in recovery, it involves breaking these very long-standing behaviors and habits
Mm,
related to, eating, exercise, self-perception, all these things. The
mm.
behavioral change required is not only like the physical, tangible adjustments, but it's also the mental commitment to sustain those changes. So, like, once that behavioral change has happened, you then have to continue to repeat that new behavior, not just once, but many more times to rewrite that neural pathway. So it might look like you're not engaging in the behavior anymore, but the continued effort to do that is still a massive mental load.
Yes.
So I think just having so much awareness of that is really important. It's amazing, right? When someone is able to like do these things for the first time, and whether it's like eating adequately or challenging fear foods, and that is amazing and necessary, but we need to have repetition. And
Yes.
often that looks like, cool, we're able to do the thing and like eat the meal plan and go out for the meals, or not like sustain from these behaviors, but you're still putting a lot of effort into doing that. So
Yes.
I really understand this one. It was like totally my experience. I see it across the board with clients. So I think just having really realistic expectations of healing is very useful for all the people involved in the process.
Yes. We love the people. Um, this is something that I find very frustrating about, messages like all in. I think we're letting people down because, and it almost backs up the stigma of like, just eat a burger. Just eat a burger. Just go and eat something, right? It's a mental illness. Why we still have to get people, even within our own circles, to understand this, that the physical is one domino and the following dominoes are numerous and have nothing to do with the physical. So I find this incredibly frustrating because I think that people can be offered a recovery that they just deserve more. They deserve better. They deserve a more fulsome
Mm,
recovery. It's like I had a question for my fully recovered Q&A I did recently where they were like, you know, how did you find yourself after recovery? And I was like, I found myself because of recovery. Like
mm.
and that had
Yeah.
nothing to do with what my body did. Nothing. I mean, the body changing was the precursor to me having to unpack some important things and learn some important lessons. But the body and the food stuff, when I remember the most pivotal moments of my recovery, they're right down the bottom of the list.
Exactly. I completely agree with this. And I think for someone who has come in, whether they've done all in or they just didn't sort of have this like deeper understanding of the different layers of recovery and what it really requires, they're going to get to that point where they have like less behaviors. And if they had to weight restore and they're at that point and they're finding stability there, and then feel so disheartened
Yeah.
that the likelihood of them then being like, I knew it, or the eating sort of being like, I knew you wouldn't get feel better or whatever. And
Yep.
then them cool, babe, let's head back to the roundabout. Like I think
Hmm.
that's so often what people experience. They're like, it doesn't get better. I'm like, whoa, 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 it does. This is new for you. Like we're on new territory. We have to just take it
Yes.
one day at a time. And I think people often also feel like just often the cognitive stuff, like we know that there's so many approaches in how you challenge this in your dialogue, and it can be very intentional about it. But I think if you've just kind of been focused on just the behavioral stuff, you can almost get to this point of be like, but I don't know how to do that. So I think
Yeah.
this is again why coaching is so useful, because we teach you those actual skills of not only how to make the behavioral change, but how to do the cognitive stuff behind it.
Yes, and locked in hand in hand, right? It's like when I do my consultations and I'm like, the two things we're going to be doing all the way through our absolute cornerstone will be goal setting and taking the action and dialoguing, and help seeking is obviously like a third little strand there, but that gets introduced
Yeah.
in those early stages. But right up at the beginning is that cognitive interaction with yourself, which is being prompted by the action you're
Yeah.
taking, and
Yeah.
just that on a
Absolutely.
cycle. It's one of my favorite things. We take this very mysterious process and we go, it's actually not that mysterious, guys.
You just gotta turn the
Mystery's
lights on.
gone.
Totally fine. You just gotta turn the lights on.
Yeah, yeah, love it, love it. Next one, that we do not choose to have eating disorders. Did you choose your eating disorder from the
Yeah.
catalog?
What's the mental illness I'm going to take today? I'll
Yeah,
take it. Yeah. I'll put down a deposit now.
yeah.
Um, this one, I think is, again, it's so frustrating for people, right? Because obviously these conditions arise from really complex interactions with so many various factors that are environmental and psychological and biological that makes them medical issues. They're not lifestyle decisions.
Mm.
And I think maybe people who feel this way, right? Like say they are someone who they are like a loved one or something and they do interact with the eating disorder world. Maybe like I could take a guess at there, maybe at the like butt end of witnessing some like eating disorder backlash,
Mm.
which could make it look like that someone is choosing their eating disorder if they were resisting treatment. But I think it's really important for those people, whether parents or friends or partners, to understand that that person who might be behind that fierce facade of the eating disorder is likely a deeply distressed person who is holding on for dear life
Yeah.
because they feel like they are at risk of losing their perceived safety mechanism. And I think that desperation for safety can often be expressed in these ways that might mirror that it looks like someone is choosing this. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like, I do that metaphor about if you were out in the middle of the ocean, you had
Yeah.
nothing to hold on to, something floated by, you'd hold on to it. That's not someone saying, well, between the boat and this really crappy little like life raft that's floated by, I'm going to pick that they only have the crappy little life raft. There is no boat, not yet. But to
Yeah.
them, it is not, oh, I'm actually on solid land and I'm going to go and swim out until
Yes.
I'm in danger, and then I hope something will show up. They have been dropped in something that they didn't choose, but when something came along that looked safe, they grabbed on for it, which is so human and understandable. Um, I often use that metaphor with people who've never had eating disorders, and as soon as I say that, they're like, "Oh my God, that actually makes so much sense."
Mm.
I think that where a lot of this stigma comes from is that we know that dieting is a huge precursor to eating disorders. It's a big, big vulnerable spot. We know that it is a big contributor to people ending up with eating disorders. Now, do people choose to go on diets? Yes, they do. Now, how much that is actually true because of social conditioning and, diet culture and whether or not that's an informed choice you make as a question for another day, but you can choose to go on a diet. You can't choose whether or not you have the predisposition, particularly the genetic predisposition, which you may have no awareness about, that diet will trigger, right? We know that there are a range of complex contributors to eating disorders. You can just use one and you can have an eating disorder as a result. And that includes restraining your food intake. You can have zero other contributors, and that alone can trigger an eating disorder. So I think
Mm.
it gets very, very oversimplified down to, well, look at somebody's path in, and that if they've chose the diet, then they chose the eating disorder, which is ridiculous because they had no knowledge or awareness of that, right? And the more that
Mm.
we're learning about these genetics through, the genetic study that's being conducted around anorexia, and the fact we believe we found the first anorexia genetic marker, and those studies are now being broadened out to, I believe, binge eating disorder is the next area that they're looking at. And we have found these markers, means that, as Carolyn says, the genetic component is the loaded gun, the environment is the trigger. And if you
Mm.
have that genetic gun, you try in this day and age, in this world, to not get that triggered.
Yeah.
Whether by
Good luck to
trauma
you.
or by diet culture or by being bullied in school because of your body size or
Mm.
going through some awful family experience growing up or a loss of whatever it is, right? Like you try with that particular gene to not get that triggered in our world.
Absolutely. And I think, also where the choice lies is to get out of an eating disorder. That is a choice that someone has to make every single day. And it is probably the most brave choice that someone continues to make every single day because some days are going to be easier to make that choice than others.
Yeah, absolutely. Beautifully put. And then the last one we had of the many that were sent through was that people from all cultures and races can have eating disorders. It doesn't just impact white people. This came through a lot, which whenever I ask questions like this is a really common one. And it doesn't surprise me. And it is very
Yeah.
deserving of a space on the list.
It's really important to be so inclusive in these conversations because it actually often is those groups that are less spoken about that aren't the stereotype who
Mm.
could be at a higher risk of eating disorders or body dysmorphia or any of these things because of some of the extra risk factors. Like, for example, people who are non-binary or part of the gender diverse communities experience incredibly high rates of eating disorders and body dissatisfaction because
Yes.
they have those extra layers of discrimination, right? I think even another thing that I think we could also pull into this conversation, which is important to talk about, is to also look at some of like the socioeconomic status stuff. Because again, I think some of those extra layers to vulnerability to individuals are often overlooked, like not only in the development of eating disorder and those statistics, but also in the recovery statistics.
Mm.
Because like if we look at individuals, right, who come from like higher socioeconomic backgrounds, they're going to have naturally better access to healthcare, mental health services, nutritional education, which often is going to be able to like facilitate earlier intervention and recovery. But then on the other end of that, those who are from like lower socioeconomic backgrounds may struggle to access some of those really essential services, which of course is going to delay treatment. So, as well as like throw things in there like stress or financial hardship are also obviously going to develop affect the development of eating disorders, but then also the pathway to recovery. So there's so much here I think that we could potentially unpack.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point. The stigma where, kind of like the vanity question, right? Where when
Yeah.
we're trying to, because I do this with Butterfly when we go to like major donor events or, having lunch with people who have the capacity to really make a financial difference to what we're doing. And they
Yeah.
have some of these misconceptions. And it's kind of well, if it's privileged people who are dealing with it, why would we give our money? They have the resources to get help and to get treatment. And it's like, that's absolutely not true for everyone who's even within those categories. But certainly it's just not the makeup of the sufferer population that we see,
Yes.
right? Like we know, for instance, that Latino women are actually more likely to be vulnerable to an eating disorder than white women by like, I think it's a percentage point. We know that Black women have similar rates of developing eating disorders as white women, but their ability to access care is
Mm.
absolutely through the floor because there's already built-in ingrained medical discrimination that isn't impacting white people. So yeah, when we're advocating for the group, we are really advocating for the group, and that's why that first dismantling of that stigma of the one that you mentioned of young white privileged, often teenage girls, right? It seems like all of these efforts to diminish like why we would help people with eating disorders, right? And just like take the responsibility off ourselves as a collective, where when we actually look at all of the intersections and some of the ones that you've mentioned as well across the kind of gender spectrum or the sexuality spectrum, it touches everyone. And as I said earlier in the episode, like the easiest way for me to break the ice in any room at any event is to tell people what I do for a living. And it doesn't matter what room I'm in or who I'm speaking to or what their background is or what their socioeconomic level is. They have a story, whether it's their own or whether it's a family member or whether it's a girlfriend or a boyfriend or it's just somebody in their orbit who has had a terrible experience usually with an eating disorder and never
Yeah.
a clean, clear, steady path towards recovery. I don't think any of us really get anything that smooth sailing. But certainly, as we start to see all these intersections of marginalization, that complexity just gets deeper and deeper, and that path towards recovery gets more and more difficult and hampered. And there's just so many more obstacles to overcome. So we've always
Yes.
got to be taking into account like the most disenfranchised. Like that should be our standard of awareness and advocacy and treatment
Yes.
is it has
Yes.
to be that broad and that open so that we're not falling into some of because I think sometimes we can um yeah just not it can be difficult like it's like on Instagram I have a disclaimer in my posts where I say, not every post
Mm.
will speak to you, but I hope in the totality of my work that something does speak to you. We can't broaden every conversation to the point where it loses all meaning, but we do absolutely
Yeah.
have to, at the most basic level, be taking into consideration how to make our messaging and our overall work as inclusive as possible and to make sure that everybody is feeling seen at one point or
Yes.
another.
Yes, and I think this also really speaks to the need for, yes, inclusivity, but also individualized treatment because everyone's background is different, everyone's needs are different, everyone's path forward because of their accessibility is going to be different as well. It's
Yeah.
been like a really expansive experience for me as a coach, just really being able to like see the person and see
Yes.
their story and want to learn about who they are and what their story is to then be able to understand how can I best support you, in what way do you need support, and what's like how can I help put together what the roadmap actually is for you. Like even like there's so many factors that I think are so often overlooked when we're talking about like all of these different intersections. And I think like one, particularly if we talk about like that group again of like, say like someone's in like that lower socioeconomic status, which is like huge risk factors,
Yeah.
is something like, like food insecurity, right? Which is
Mm.
not something that other people would have to really like worry about or even have any awareness about, which for, like families who are of that economic status, like even things like food scarcity can cause like a
Yes.
preoccupation with food, right? Which then could like may increase like irregular eating patterns or binge eating or like hoarding behaviors. So it has to be so individualized and not just looking at like this one person and yes, like their genetic situation and their financial situation, but all of these aspects. And I think that's
Mm.
also why working with teams and working with practitioners that you feel completely understood by and like
Yes.
have a trust with is so important for the longevity of someone's recovery and healing.
Absolutely. And, obviously it's our job to educate ourselves and to meet our clients where they are and to
Mm,
learn from them as well. Like when there are cultural elements to
mm,
somebody's experience, like,
yep.
where comments on bodies are much more acceptable in, certain areas and in certain cultures. And so it's not no good for me to say to that person, well, let's just work on telling them not to say that. And they're like, that is never going to happen, Mia. Like that is never going to happen. Like, so I then have to adjust maybe what I would suggest to somebody else to go, okay, all right, great. Tell me about that. Let's see what the framework is and what the edges of what's possible might be, and we'll get as
Mm,
close to those edges as possible. So
yep.
it's incredibly important as a professional to drop your biases and to be aware of the fact that your biases might be showing up in ways that you're not previously aware of, and to learn from your client and be willing to sort of like humble yourself into learning what you need to help that person as an individual, where there are some of maybe those cultural differences or just differences across your two experiences, or
Mm,
differences outside of maybe how you've been trained or how your training was biased to treat
mm,
only certain subsets of the population. Um, but also for you as an individual to seek out people first and foremost who maybe, especially if they have lived experience, that they are close to your lived experience in the ways that you know that you probably need to feel pretty comfortable and have that implicit trust built in already. So yeah, I think there's so much to be done here from a treatment perspective, advocacy perspective, awareness perspective. It is, in my over 10 years in the space, it has improved dramatically, but there is always a ways to go.
mm. Yeah, I feel like this conversation could go on for such a long time because there's so many different aspects to it. But I think us just also remaining open-minded and yeah, like you're saying, like learning from the people is I think the step to seeing more and more growth and us just pushing forwards and the whole eating disorder practitioner sector just moving forwards in this area that is more inclusive and it is more individualized.
Absolutely. So speaking of the people, thank you to the people for
So
being
sorry
here
about
with us today. I
that.
will try to drop that out of my verbal. I get myself stuck in a verbal record skipper, so hopefully that'll be out by the next time we have a chat to you. But Hol, where will you be? Because we'll probably record not next week, but probably the following. Where will you be then?
I'll still be here. I'll be surfing up a storm in Santa Teresa, I think.
Oh gosh, tough life, tough life.
Tough
Um,
life.
so we will look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks with another episode. As always, let us know your thoughts or what you wish people knew about eating disorders in the comments below. We love to always see your feedback, and we will see you very soon. Thanks.
Thank you. See you soon.